From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Chris Payne. It's Tuesday, June 27. It's been a chaotic 48 hours in Russia that put the world's most notorious leader, Vladimir Putin, in the crosshairs. Putin is, of course, no stranger to the headlines, but this story was different.
Today, the world saw that the bosses of Russia do not control anything, nothing at all, complete chaos. It's been a day.
The boss of the notorious Wagner Group shocked the world by turning his band of ruthless mercenaries on the Kremlin and threatening to march on Moscow.
The Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was leading the armed rebellion after accusing Russian forces of striking a military camp and killing thousands of his followers.
It was a shocking display of belligerence from a man who'd long been an ally of Putin. Now the man who's pulled Russia's strings for decades faced, as he described, an act of treason from one of his own puppets.
President Vladimir Putin scrambled his own forces, declaring this an event of mutiny and an act of treason. But over the past few...
The chaotic events unfolded quickly and posed serious questions about Putin's grip on power, the future of the war in Ukraine, and how a hotdog-selling warlord could turn Putin's secret army against him. Today, Sherryn Groch on the man who challenged Putin, and Peter Hartcher on what it means for the Russian leader's future. Sherryn, if this was the draft script for a Hollywood film, it'd be thrown out for being too outrageous. Could you walk us through, in a nutshell, what happened in the last 48 hours?
Yes, let's picture this. Interior Putin's bunker. He's scrolling through Telegram and a video pops up from one of his, maybe not best pals, but one of his loyal guys anyway, the head of his group of mercenaries who are fighting in Ukraine, Wagner. And this guy, Prigozhin, is saying that the war is based on a lie. There's no real threat to Russia from Ukraine at all. It was all about the elites and the generals deceiving Putin so they could get rich in Ukraine. And he's accusing these Russian generals of bombing his Wagner base, and he's vowing revenge. So very quickly, this really just spiraled into something. He and his mercenaries were seizing military headquarters. They were pushing into 2 Russian towns. Before long, they were rolling on Moscow itself. And Putin was taking to state television to denounce this guy who had been known as one of his most loyal attack dogs as a traitor, and saying that, all these treasonous rebels would be punished. And then you've got Wagner shooting down Russian planes. Eventually, the Russian military itself started firing on this convoy of Wagner mercenaries. And it was starting to look like Russia was actually descending into civil war. But then there came a big twist, and it was announced that Russia had brokered a deal with the Wagner mercenaries, with Prigozhin, and this had happened via the Kremlin's ally, neighbouring Belarus. And sort of a deal had happened there where basically Russia agreed to drop the charges against Prigozhin. In exchange, he called off his men. And we're really still just watching the dust settle now to see what happens next, because as every Russian expert I spoke to in the last 24 hours or 48 hours has said to me, this isn't quite over yet.
Now, you've written about the Wagner Group before, a notorious mercenary group and its once mysterious leader. But what can you tell us now about Yevgeny Prigozhin and how he rose through Putin's vertical of power?
Yes, so he rose basically because he made himself useful to Putin. He served serious jail time in the 80s for armed robbery and a whole mix of things. Then he turned his family's little hot dog stand into a string of high-end restaurants, and that's where he met Putin. He used to come into the restaurants when he worked in government in St. Petersburg, and through their sort of connection, Prigozhin himself ended up with a string of really lucrative catering contracts with the Kremlin when Putin became president. So that's why people call him Putin's chef. He's not actually a chef, but he's known as Putin's fixer. He makes things happen. So when there was a big pro-democracy uprising in Russia a bit over a decade ago, he sent out online bots to disrupt them. And that kind of morphed into the troll farm known as the Internet Research Agency, which meddled in the 2016 US election. And of course, when Russia sent its little green men into Crimea in 2014 and this war really began, Prigozhin figured out Putin needed a more covert force for fighters that he could send into places unofficially. And so he created the Wagner mercenaries. They're meant to be sort of this elite fighting outfit. They're often kind of retired Russian soldiers. They are in the past have been very fearsome fighters. And he used them to push into all places, not just Ukraine, but to expand Russia's influence in Africa and Syria. They backed the Assad regime in Syria. They also got some very lucrative oil fields in Africa. They've managed to seize diamond mines and gold mines. So that's kind of how Prigozhin fits into the mix. He's always been Putin's guy. So for him to turn on Putin in this moment, I mean, some people have described it as sort of like, Pinocchio becoming a real boy because he's always sort of been a puppet of the regime.
Yeah, our colleague Peter Hartcher described it as the puppet turning on the puppet master. Tensions between Prigozhin and Russia's military leadership, and it's not just Putin here, it's some of his top officials as well, have been building for months. So why now?
Well, things are really coming to a head. So, for one thing, Wagner hasn't been able to fix Russia's failing war efforts. So, in the past, Wagner has made a few gains where the Russian army, which was revealed, as we all know, to be very incompetent, hollowed out by corruption, Wagner sometimes was able to push in. And so more and more Russian army generals were actually relying on Prigozhin's mercenaries to fill gaps because they were such fearsome, feared fighters. But now more and more it was looking like, look, even Wagner can't fix this war for us. And tensions between Prigozhin and the big generals were really starting to boil over. And so in that video, he accused them of bombing a Wagner base, which is, a big accusation. The Kremlin is insisting it's fake news, but it's very hard to tell which of these camps are telling the truth. Neither of them are known for their honesty. And it's kind of interesting, I guess. I've been trying to sort of understand why now, because to move against Putin is such a dangerous move. In Putin's Russia, the rule is you never go against the Don. It is a mafia state, and everything you have as an oligarch, as a general, is down to him giving it to you. So Prigozhin in the past has had influence because he's had Putin, having his back. So this was a big moment. I mean, it's possible Prigozhin has really gained a following on social media. Wagner is, huge on Telegram. There's a lot of really rabid pro-Russian bots and real people on there singing their praises. It's possible that it went to his head. Since this war began, he's really kind of stepped out of the shadows. He's finally admitted that he owns Wagner after, suing journalists for making the connection. And, he's now appearing on promotional posters. He gets his own production studios to create propaganda videos saying we're the real heroes of the war. He was rising faster and faster as this almost alternate figure to Putin. It was starting to get dangerous.
So what was Prigozhin's endgame here, do you think? He never really intended to send his men all the way into a brutal battle on the streets of Moscow, right?
Yeah, this is what everyone is trying to puzzle out because it just seems like such an obvious suicide mission. I mean, the Russian army could just fire on that convoy. It was quite remarkable that it took them so long to fire on the Wagner convoy, really. And so this is where it comes to questions of state of mind, or maybe was there someone within that regime, within those more sophisticated elites, who were maybe giving Prigozhin the green light? And I think in the wash, this might be what we see. I mean, even if Prigozhin himself is neutralised as a threat, that doesn't mean there won't be other challenges because Putin's wounded now. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories online that maybe this whole thing was orchestrated, and because the Kremlin do, operate using so much of this fake news, I can understand that. But for Prigozhin to have come out and said the war is a lie, and that is such a dangerous thing to say because everyone knows the war was Putin's decision alone. I sort of can't see how that benefits Putin to look weak like this and to have the whole war questioned when we know he wants Ukraine more than anything, and he's kind of staked his legacy on it. He's staked now maybe his presidency on it. The stakes are incredibly high for both of them. So it could have been just a case of, if I don't do this, maybe someone will come for me. Or perhaps there was a few people already on the inside giving him the green light. He does have contacts of his own in the security services. But of course, Putin is Putin, and there's a reason no one has stuck their head above the parapet yet and taken a shot at him until now.
So what happens to the Wagner Group now? Will Prigozhin continue to run it from exile in Belarus? Do the soldiers just go back to Ukraine and keep fighting Russia's fight?
Yeah, this is a great question because Wagner, when the war began, they had forces in all over the world, particularly in Africa and Central Africa, and they didn't just take those guys and send them to Ukraine like, to be honest, I expected. They actually kept those forces in Africa where they've been really upping their influence, particularly around places like Mali and pushing in around gold mines and diamond mines. So those guys are still there. And the question is, will Prigozhin be allowed to run those operations from Belarus, from exile? Is that part of the reason he's been allowed to live? Because to be honest, enemies of the Kremlin, traitors of Putin, they don't have a very long shelf life. And, if you're trying to hide from the Kremlin, Belarus is one of the worst places to go. It's a very close ally of Putin. So it's very interesting to see what happens now and what the Wagner fighters themselves accept. Prigozhin was so adamant that they weren't going to be folded in to the army. There was this push for them to be contracted in under the Russian military, and that's part of what caused a lot of this anger in recent days. So the question is, will they accept that now that Prigozhin is kind of, abdicated, left the field? Or if the Kremlin moves against him, if something else happens, will they themselves stir up again? This is very much anything could happen at this stage, I think.
Sherryn, thank you so much for joining Please Explain.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. I'm going to be glued to my screen over the next few days.
Up next, Peter Hartcher on the fallout for Putin and what this means for his grip on power. Peter, in your terrific analysis piece, you wrote that this insurrection had wounded Putin in 3 key ways. Can you talk about that?
Well, what Prigozhin has done is really damaged Putin's legitimacy of his war. He's damaged by exposing the weakness of the military. He's damaged the military standing of Putin and his armies, and he's demonstrated the weakness of Putin's political position. So to take those in turn, as you know, and I'm sure we all remember, Putin justified the war, the invasion of Ukraine, by saying that Ukraine and NATO posed a risk to Russia and that Ukraine needed to be demilitarized and denazified. And Prigozhin has gone out publicly in a tirade, launching his coup, to say that that's a bunch of lies, that there was no threat from Ukraine, no threat from NATO, that it had nothing to do, there was no demilitarization or denazification required, and that, in fact, this was simply a bunch of Putin's cronies who wanted to get hold of the economic assets of Ukraine and divvy up the spoils. So that's pretty fatal damage to the whole claimed legitimacy for this illegal invasion. That's the first thing. Second thing is, by getting all the way to within 200 kilometres of Moscow with an armed convoy, having declared that he was going to try and wage a coup against at least the military leadership and maybe Putin himself, he met barely any resistance. He was able to get within 200 kilometres of Moscow before being negotiated out of that action. So what of the Russian military? Why so feeble? Is its loyalty in question, or is it just more incompetence? And then finally, the third one is Putin's political position. Having threatened in his national address, Putin had said that this was an act of treachery and that the traitor would be punished severely, the inevitable punishment, he called it. Yet he turned around and cut a very, very easy deal with Prigozhin to allow him to leave the country unpunished and to take some of his fighters with him. So that signals to everybody that Putin is in a weak position, and that invites further attacks on him within Russia by anybody who has an alternative agenda, anybody who has political ambitions. And externally, it encourages Russia's foes. Of course, primary among those is Ukraine, but also NATO, the US, the Europeans who are supporting Ukraine. The old analogy of blood in the water, I think, applies here, Chris. So his legitimacy, his military, and his political standing all have been really quite badly damaged, I would suggest, by this weekend.
Now, it appears there was some intelligence to indicate that this coup was coming. Certainly, sources in the United States indicate that there was intelligence in the weeks leading up. But this seems to have taken Putin by surprise. How on earth could he have not known this was coming?
An excellent question. We see multiple failures of basic competence and professionalism. And while we've become accustomed to that on the battlefield in Ukraine, this exposes it at the highest levels of intelligence and politics in Russia. It looks like the Americans are able to read Putin's mail, or the Russian regime's mail, better than Putin himself. Either that or Putin did get warnings and simply didn't take them seriously. Either way, it's either a failure of performance or a failure of judgment. There was a commentator in Russia who said, how on earth did it happen that Putin didn't have 2 or 3 people in Prigozhin's inner circle who were in a position on a given signal to shoot him in the head? How were these basics of traditional Russian political management not enforced? These are good questions. The only answers seem to be misjudgment or incompetence, and neither is a very good look for Vladimir Putin, who styles himself, as you know, as an invincible Superman.
What does this mean for the war in the Ukraine?
It energizes the Ukrainians. It's a tremendous asset for Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader. It's very encouraging for him and for his troops and for the Ukrainian people as a whole. As you know, their morale, their willpower, their determination has been possibly, together with the supply of allied weaponry and intelligence, the defining factor in Ukraine's ability to prevail, or at least to survive against the Russian invasion for 16 months now. And that morale, that willpower, has now only been strengthened by these events. It must also have the obverse effect on the Russian military. So if you're a Russian soldier or a Russian officer or a Russian commander, and you see the most effective of Russia's military commanders in this war, Prigozhin and his Wagner Group, not only deserting the battlefield, but turning on the president and insulting the president, insulting the Ministry of Defense, insulting the military leadership of Russia, your own morale must be affected. You must apply the same questions. You must start to doubt the legitimacy of the war, the competence of the leadership, and then to see this act of treason go unpunished must again make commanders and soldiers in the field really question Putin's strength, Putin's power, the durability of the regime. And so if the regime is not durable, why should I follow orders to endanger my life in a cause that is now suddenly exposed as being even less useful, purposeful, successful and legitimate than it was just a couple of days ago? It's really got a ripple through both the Ukrainian and their allies' sides, but also the Russian sides in a way that's very unhelpful to Russia.
Mick Ryan, the retired ADF Major General, wrote in his analysis for our mastheads that potentially Putin might seek to double down in Ukraine and flex his muscles, if you like. Do you think there's a chance that could happen?
Well, yes, but again, that would test Putin's strength, because to double down implies finding more troops. And to find more troops implies that he would be forced into another enlistment, another mobilization, a compulsory enlistment. And the Russian people, first of all, are in a pretty unhappy mood. The war is demonstrably failing. For more civilians to be drafted, neither they nor their families presumably will be very happy about that. And that will put yet more strain on the internal political support for Putin. So I think it's difficult for Putin to attempt anything like that, anything in the way of a larger mobilization of troops. We know that he's got trouble with supplies. It's difficult to see how he can apply much more power on the battlefield without testing his political standing at home. So I think he's in an invidious position. And, there's talk about extreme options. The nuclear one persistently is discussed and has been for months. I think if Putin thought that it would work for him, he would have used them already and may yet use them. But rational calculus says that he won't, because it would be at least as damaging to Russia as it would to Ukraine. And yet, I suppose the caveat on that is always that the invasion itself from the very beginning was not really a rational calculus. So perhaps we can't be entirely confident in that.
So more broadly, what now for Putin and his future, Peter? Can we expect further challenges to his power?
Look, I'm not an expert I'm not a Kremlinologist, but having talked to people who are and read their work, the consensus answer seems to be yes, that this will encourage rivals and foes. It will encourage other players in the political system, both politicians, oligarchs, military leaders and others, to start cutting their own deals and seeking out their own alliances and relationships independent of Putin, and therefore undercutting his power further. So the consensus view seems to be yes.
Peter, thank you so much for joining Please Explain.
Pleasure, Chris.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Chris Payne. This is Please Explain. Thank you for listening.